Directions. You will now be asked a question about a familiar topic. After you hear the question, you will have 15 seconds to plan your response and 45 seconds to speak.
Do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Private cars should not be allowed in the city centers of large cities. Use details and examples to explain your opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep.
That is an interesting question. Personally, I definitely think that the large city center is no place for a car. One reason for that is the space scarcity. I remember when I traveled to Moscow last summer and the city center was completely overcrowded. Tourists were everywhere and one tourist got hit by a car because he was pushed to the road since there was no space on a sidewalk. Another important issue to consider here is air pollution. Statistics show that the air conditions in modern city centers are extremely poor, and the excessive amount of private cars only makes the problem worse. So, to sum up, I would say that I undoubtedly agree with the statement due to aforesaid reasons.
In this question, you will read a short passage about a campus situation and then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then answer a question using information from both the reading passage and the talk. After the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. Read an article in the campus newspaper. You will have 45 seconds to read the article. Begin reading now. Now listen to two students discussing the article.
Hey, did you read about this plan?
Yeah, and I think it's a really great idea.
Why's that?
Well, a lot of new students really need this. I mean, it's not just about getting extra help with the course material. They'll probably also get information about things like taking notes or the best way to study for exams.
Yeah, I barely even knew how to do those things when I first came here.
Neither did I. So these are things most students wind up having to learn on their own at first. That's why so many of them have a hard time.
And it's probably good that they can work with somebody who has the same interests.
Right. That would be a real advantage, to get information about the classes you're going to need to take from somebody who's already taken those classes. And they could recommend professors and tell you who the best advisors in the department are. Things like that.
I see what you mean. So new students could get access to information about the program from another student's point of view.
Exactly.
The woman expresses her opinion about the university's plan. Briefly summarize the plan, then state her opinion about the plan, and explain the reasons she gives for holding that opinion.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep.
The reading passage announces the university's plan. In particular, it proposes free tutoring for all first-year students in order to assist them with their academic coursework. The woman in the conversation supports the plan and thinks that it is a great idea. To start, she says that new students have hard time without tutoring because at the beginning of their studying they usually don't know how to take notes or prepare for an exam in a proper way. Tutors can help them with that. In addition, she explains that being tutored by people who have the same interests and who already took the same classes can be a huge advantage. For instance, such tutors can recommend the best professors to study with. As you can see, the woman in the listening definitely agrees with the plan and provides clear reasons for her opinion.
In this question, you will read a short passage on an academic subject and then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then answer a question using information from both the reading passage and the talk. After the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. Read a passage about the familiarity principle from a psychology textbook. You will have 50 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now. Now listen to part of a lecture on this topic in a psychology class.
Some researchers did an experiment related to this. What they did was they assembled a group of subjects, a group of students, and they showed these students a series of geometrical shapes. These were very distinctive shapes, a little unusual, not the kind of shapes the students often see. But they only showed the students the shapes for a very short period of time, about a second. They also lowered the light in the room to make it even more difficult for the students to see the shapes. So the shapes were there for a split second in dim light, and then they were gone. In the next step of the experiment, the researchers again showed the students some shapes, but this time they gave the students a longer time to look at them. And this time they showed the images in pairs, 2 at a time. In each pair, one shape was a shape the students had already seen, for just a split second, in dim light, and the other was some other shape that hadn't been shown to them before. After presenting each pair, the researchers asked the students to say which of the 2 shapes they liked better. Most of the time, the students preferred the shape they'd already seen earlier in the experiment. Now, if you asked them if they'd already seen that shape, they probably wouldn't know for sure. But that didn't matter. They still tended to prefer the shapes they'd already seen.
Explain how the experiment described by the professor illustrates the familiarity principle.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep.
According to the reading, the familiarity principle can be described as people's tendency to develop a preference for things they are familiar with. In the lecture, the professor delves deeper into this subject by providing an example of an experiment related to this principle. In the first step of this experiment, researchers assembled a group of students and showed them series of unusual geometrical shapes for about a second in a dim light. After that, they showed those shapes again, but for a longer time, and in pairs with new shapes that hadn't been shown. Subsequently, the researchers asked students which of those two shapes they liked better, and students tended to prefer the shape they'd already seen. These results perfectly illustrate the way that familiarity principle works.
In this question, you will listen to a short lecture. You will then be asked to summarize important information from the lecture. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. Listen to part of a lecture in a biology class.
So, okay, we've been talking about frogs, and like all amphibians, frogs have thin skin, which means that they lose moisture through their skin easily. Now, typically, we think of frogs as living in wet environments, but for frogs who live in dry places with desert-like conditions, this can be a problem. Frogs have been able to survive in such areas by having different physical features, special dry climate features that help them maintain an adequate level of moisture in their cells and avoid drying out. Some frogs do this by preventing water loss through their skin. By creating a sort of covering over their skin, they greatly reduce their skin's exposure to the dry air. The covering acts like a barrier that locks in moisture. For example, some frogs secrete a substance through their skin, a fatty substance that they rub all over their skin using their hands and feet, which creates a waxy layer all around their bodies that's almost completely watertight. Other frogs maintain an adequate level of moisture through a different physical feature, one that allows them to store water inside their bodies for later use. A specially modified internal organ inside their bodies enables them to have a high water storage capacity. So the frogs are able to absorb and store moisture during wet, rainy times, which they can rely on to get through dry periods. The aptly named water-holding frog, for example, has a bladder that is highly elastic and stretchable. When it does rain, the frog absorbs water through its skin, and its bladder stretches to hold this extra water. The water is then slowly released from the special bladder into the frog's internal tissues until the next rain, which might not be for several months.
Using points and examples from the lecture, explain two dry climate features of frogs.
Please prepare your answer after the beep. Please begin speaking after the beep.
The professor goes into a ton of detail about dry climate features of frogs. She elaborates on the fact that frogs have thin skin, which means that they tend to lose moisture easily, and they need special physical features in order to avoid drying out. One of these special features is the frog's ability to create covering over their skin that acts as a barrier that prevents the water loss. Namely, some frogs secrete a special fatty substance that they rub all over themselves to form a waxy layer that is watertight. Another frog's feature that the lecturer mentions is high water storage capacity. Frogs store water inside their bodies using the bladder, an internal organ that absorbs moisture which they can rely on during dry periods. I had never heard of this topic before, and after hearing this lecture, I now have a great understanding of frogs' dry climate features.